On Sunday, March 10th, 1929, the Black Hand responded. Following the 9 a.m. Mass, Father Riccardi walked to the rear of the church to perform a baptism. In the vestibule, he met Mammy Guerrieri, a 27-year-old greasy-haired woman accompanied by her 5-year-old daughter. "I'm glad you sent your little girl back to school," the priest said, trying to make conversation with the woman. Before he could say anything else, Guerrieri pulled out a revolver and fired 5 shots at point-blank range. 2 bullets hit the priest. Father Riccardi died later that day. At trial, the accused, Guerrieri, was found not guilty of murder on the sole ground of insanity. The faithful of the parish were shaken, and the 6-year-old Rita had encountered her first martyr. You never saw a whole parish cry as they did. It was just a serious, terrible breach of justice. No one was ever punished. Mother Angelica knitted her brow and shook her head in disgust at the memory. I think in our lives, that was a big loss because Father Riccardi was somebody who understood us. For Rita and May, the final pillar supporting their lives had crumbled. Then, in October 1929, the Great Depression hit, devouring the scant savings of people in southeast Canton and elsewhere. For the rest of her life, May Rizzo refused to deposit her cash in a bank. Always prepared for a second crash, May hoarded her money in a bag for easy accessibility. The death of their pastor and the financial insecurity of the times ushered in a downward spiral of hard knocks, which would test mother and daughter. In 1930, John Rizzo returned to Canton and visited his family at the Gianfrancesco's home. Though May still had feelings for John, her trust in him had died long ago. The awkward meeting went nowhere, and May abruptly asked him to leave. On September 24, 1930, she filed a divorce petition at the Stark County Courthouse in Canton. The document mentioned John's extreme cruelty, the beatings, the verbal lashings, and his failure to provide for the family. It begged the court to grant May alimony and custody of Rita. The 7-year-old child tried to make sense of it all: the abusive marriage, the long absence of her father, and the emotional decomposition of the only parent she really knew. Though it would have been natural for her to turn to her mother for comfort, Rita knew, even at 7, that this was impossible. Unable to cope with the finality of the divorce, May was increasingly hysterical and given to crying fits. Rita had only herself to rely on. Sometimes I used to wonder if there was a God, and if there was such a person, I couldn't figure out why he wouldn't let me have a family like the other kids, Mother Angelica observed, a faraway look in her eyes. She was an adult all her life, Angelica's cousin Joanne Samia said. She never had a childhood. In later life, through her television network, Rita brought light to the dark places of the world, places where the forgotten congregated: bars, nursing homes, hospitals, and rundown motels. When she spoke, they felt she understood their pain, their busted marriages, their alcohol addiction, their dysfunctional families. She seemed like one of them. Behind the veil, the twinkling eyes, and the crinkled smile, they sensed that she too had been wounded, and indeed she had been. The beginning of hell. On March 10th, 1931, the court awarded May custody of Rita and $5 a week in child support. That's when hell began, Mother Angelica observed. The stigma of divorce and the challenge of making a living at the height of the Depression would rack the lives of both Rita and May. It didn't help that John Rizzo rarely made his child care payments. At times, Rita would go to the courthouse and find no funds waiting for her. On one such occasion, the spunky 9-year-old tracked her father down at the men's store where he worked. I asked him for alimony and he gave me 50 cents. So the next week, I went up to the courthouse. The desk looked like it was 20 feet high. So I said to the woman that I had come for the alimony payment. She said, "Honey, your dad gave you $5 last week." I said, She said, "Honey, your dad gave you $5 last week." I said, "No, he didn't. He gave me 50 cents. So she showed me the receipt I'd given him the week before. He had added a dot and an extra zero to make it look like $5. I never went back. I never went back looking for alimony again. To make ends meet, May opened another dry cleaning business. Following disagreements with her brothers, she moved out of her parents' house. Between 1933 and 1937, May and Rita would occupy a series of rundown, occasionally rat-infested, one-bedroom apartments, usually partitioning the room for maximum usage. The front end was for the business, the back end for sleeping. When Rita and her mother were not getting along, the girl would stay with family friends, occasionally lodging with Victoria Adams, a woman who was dating John Rizzo. The serial instability had a negative impact on Rita. At St. Anthony's School, her grades slipped. Some of this could be attributed to the cruel treatment she received from the nuns as a child of divorced parents. In the early 1930s, divorce was considered a shameful act and a grave sin in the minds of most Catholics, particularly Italian Catholics. At St. Anthony's, Rita Rizzo was the only child of a broken marriage. In 1933, the sister in charge of Rita's class asked every student to sell a subscription to a Catholic magazine. Rita said she would take 2, because her Aunt Rose would likely buy 1. The nun snapped back, "Oh, you just take 1. You want to be so much, and in the end, you don't amount to anything." Tears trailed down Rita's cheeks. "I hated those nuns. I hated them," she said later. When Rita returned home, May knew something was wrong, but Rita refused to talk. May got a classmate's mother on the phone and was incensed to learn of the treatment her daughter had received. In retaliation, she pulled Rita out of St. Anthony's and sent her to a public school. Later, a priest would persuade May to re-enroll Rita at St. Anthony's, but the following year at Christmas, there would be another unpleasant party. At the conclusion of a Christmas party, the nuns distributed toys to Rita and her peers. Each child tore at the wrapping paper, producing new trinkets, waving them about, to the delight of their cohorts. When Rita's name was called, she went forward to claim her present. "I got this yo-yo. It was old and scratched, had some knots in it. You couldn't use the thing. So I went home, and my mother asked where I'd gotten it. When I told her sister had given it to me, that was the final straw." May and Rita sped to St. Anthony's Rectory, where May gave the pastor a piece of her mind. She considered the used gift a put-down, and her child would be put down by no one. Before leaving, she withdrew Rita from St. Anthony's for the last time. The stigma of divorce would also separate May from the church that had long been her support. Having avoided confession since the divorce, she was encouraged by her friends to seek the sacrament from a missionary visiting the parish. When May confessed to committing the sin of divorce, the priest hit the ceiling. "You what?" the priest railed. "Do you realize that by getting a divorce, you are excommunicating yourself?" Instead of being kind or loving to her, he blasted her, Mother Angelica said. She didn't even get a chance to say that she wasn't remarried and was obeying church law. May stormed out of the confessional and would not return to church for a decade. At about the same time, May's business was failing. Customers picking up their clothes would promise to pay the following week, but the cash rarely materialized. Too proud to return to her family, May and Rita scrapped by as best they could, at times sharing a piece of bologna, and bread for supper. Committed to her ideal of self-sufficiency, May refused to approach the Gianfrancescos for a handout, no matter how dire the circumstances. To the outside world, May Rizzo seemed the picture of confidence. She still wore her fashionable hats and maintained the slightly imperious facade that kept strangers at arm's length. All who knew her recalled a compelling raconteur, a woman who could hold an audience's attention no matter what story she was telling. Her daughter would inherit the gift. But emotionally, May Rizzo was falling apart. By 1934, poverty and chronic depression pushed her over the edge. At home, before her bewildered 11-year-old daughter, May would burst into tears, lamenting the life she had inflicted on her child, the lack of education that restricted her options, and the husband who had wronged her. 3 years after the divorce, May was incapable of tearing John Rizzo from her heart. Just the sight of him with another woman would enrage. Just the sight of him with another woman would enrage her. John Rizzo's dating only compounded May's depression, producing dark, destructive thoughts. She was always threatening suicide, Mother Angelica revealed, and when I came home from school, I never knew if I would find her dead or alive. I couldn't study or concentrate. The fixation with May's state of mind and the unceasing battle to survive deprived Rita of all outside relationships, an underlying sense that she had somehow contributed to her mother's condition only intensified her attachment to May, who became her sole focus. Much of the time, I took care of her, Mother Angelica told me. That's why I never had friends, never played with dolls. To me, life was very serious. Reversing roles, Rita became the parent and May's emotional caretaker. At 11 years of age, barely able to see over the dashboard, Rita was already driving May's car, delivering starched clothes to her mother's customers and collecting payments on Saturdays. At times, she would bring home a profit, sparking a celebration at the public library, where May would pour over books and Rita would indulge in the comics and a box of caramels. But more often than not, the girl returned from her deliveries empty-handed, and May's tears would flow. Rita helplessly absorbed her mother's sadness. Had the Lord not pulled me up, I would have had one miserable life, Mother Angelica said during a moment of reflection. I never saw any change occur. I felt I was born that way, and I would die that way. I was not bitter, just resigned. Then the miraculous intruded on Rita Rizzo's life for the first time. Returning from a downtown visit to the dentist, the lanky child looked both ways as she dashed across a large boulevard to catch a bus. Worn-out socks flopped about her ankles. She headed for the median in the center of the street, when a woman shrieked. Glancing over her right shoulder, Rita saw two headlights bearing down on her. She froze. The engine's gruff rumble grew louder. With only seconds till impact, Rita closed her eyes, paralyzed with fear. All of a sudden, it felt as if two hands under her arms picked me up. All of a sudden, it felt as if two hands under my arms picked me up. I can almost feel them when I talk about it, and put me on the island where the cars were parked, Mother told me in an awe-filled whisper. She claimed that the passerby were amazed by what they saw and stared at her in disbelief. The next day on the bus, the driver told May that he had witnessed a miracle and had never seen somebody jump so high before. Both mother and daughter considered the lifting a touch of grace during an otherwise dismal moment in their lives. By the time 14-year-old Rita started high school in 1937, she and her mother could no longer go it alone. Financial pressures forced them to return to the Gianfrancesco home, where Grandma, Grandpa, and Uncles Pete and Frank were still in residence. But the house was different now. Anthony Gianfrancesco had suffered a stroke after losing his temper with someone in the saloon. Paralyzed on one side, he hobbled around the house with the aid of a cane. The condition aggravated his hot Italian temper and added to the anxieties of the household. Regardless of the domestic challenges and May's wounded pride at having to return, at least she and Rita could expect regular meals and a roof over their heads. To spare her mother any additional anguish, Rita strove to keep her grades up at McKinley High School with mixed results. During her sophomore year, Miss Thompson, her economics teacher, spotted something in the lean, solitary underachiever. In class, the teacher announced that there was someone in the room who could be an A student and the most popular student in the school if she applied herself. Miss Thompson cornered Rita after class. "You know I was talking about you," the teacher said. "Yes," Rita replied. "Well, what are you going to do about it?" "Nothing," Rita said defiantly. "I don't like people, and I don't like you." On her way home, Rita regretted the nasty remark, but she found it difficult to restrain her choleric temperament. She couldn't have friends anyway. They would make May uneasy. and anyone demanding Rita's attention would be perceived as a threat. For May's sake, Rita had become an avowed loner. Days after her chat with the economics teacher, the McKinley High band leader approached Rita, asking if she would like to be a drum majorette and lead the band. In restitution of her cocky answer to Miss Thompson, and without knowing anything about music, she accepted the challenge. Looking back, Mother Angelica feels that Miss Thompson and the other teachers may have been conspiring to help her. In the summer of 1939, Rita took up the baton. She could twirl very well, fellow majorette, Blodwin Nist recalled. She had those big hands and did a beautiful job. Nist and Rita were the first female majorettes in McKinley High's history, performing together at games, parades, and other community functions. According to Nist, Rita was an outgoing girl with a strong sense of right and wrong. But there appears to be a disparity between Angelica's recollection of herself during this period and the public memory. Either Rita had taken a cue from her mother and adopted a cheery public mask to hide the insecurities and fears that clouded her daily life, or the newfound socialization thrust upon her as a majorette exposed the lighter side of her personality. Whichever the case might have been, none of Rita's peers were close enough to know the truth. According to interviews with her classmates, Rita had no intimate friendships at McKinley High, and aside from her majorette duties, kept to herself. Like her mother, Rita could be dodgily self-sufficient and distrustful of outsiders. She never attended a school dance, and no one recalled her dating. I never had a date. Never wanted one, Mother confided to me. I just didn't have any desire. I suppose having experienced the worst of married life, it was not at all attractive to me. In 1939, the din of the football games grated on Rita's nerves. Crowd noise and even school chatter irritated the 16-year-old. It felt like the world was coming in on her. To escape the cacophony, she would literally flee from McKinley High in the afternoons. Wearied by her jumpy state, she sought medical attention. The doctor diagnosed Rita as having a calcium deficiency, which contributed to a nervous condition. He prescribed calcium shots and nerve medication. But a mineral shortage was probably not the source of her problems. At home, May was going through her own meltdown. Crying fits were becoming more frequent, as were her suicide threats. The tactics Rita normally used to extract May from her deep depression proved unsuccessful. Worried that her mother was not herself and suffering from total fatigue, Rita decided May needed time away from Canton. With her grandparents' blessing, Rita sent May, who was in the depths of her first nervous breakdown, to Philadelphia to be with her sister, Rose. Left behind with feelings of guilt and anxiety, Rita tried to maintain a normal routine. She went to classes, earned money teaching baton twirling, and lived with the Gianfrancescos. But a despondency soon set in, a dread feeling that her fortunes would never improve, and that her mother might not recuperate. From this apathetic cauldron of misery would arise a pain that would reshape Rita Rizzo and draw her to a life she could not have imagined at the time.